our website, but I want to read you a little blurb about your presenter today. In her role at Rady Children's Hospital, San Diego, Melissa Bernstein directs the Advancing California Trauma-Informed System, that's ACTS, and Trauma-Informed Licensing Team initiatives. Her research centers around supporting systems in planning for, implementing, and sustaining trauma-informed change that aligns with best practice and science. As a psychologist working with children, youth, and families impacted by traumatic stress, she has developed expertise in understanding child maltreatment and utilizing evidence-based practices at an individual, family, and system level. So I am so excited to present with Melissa today, and I'm going to hand it on over to her. You're in for a treat. Thank you so much. Dr. Bernstein, take it away.
Thanks, Jess. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you guys today. I really love that the icebreaker question, not only because it's fun to hear all of the movies you guys like, but now I know what an engaging group you all are. So I'm super excited for that engagement to keep going during our time together today. I know you guys have probably been on a ton of Zoom webinars and meetings, so we'll be engaging you guys through the chat box and some other activities today. So I'm really excited to be with you all to talk about this topic, trauma, compassion fatigue, and secondary traumatic stress that impacts so many of us, and there's really been a calling for in the last few years. So Jess kindly mentioned the projects that I work for, and in one of them, we work with child welfare counties across the state of California, and we have them choose an area of trauma-informed care that they'd like to work on, kind of meeting them where they're at. And 60% of our partnering counties chose to work on secondary traumatic stress. So really dedicating time and resources to supporting staff and dealing with the emotional impact of the work that they do. So it's a timely topic, it's an important topic, not only for our own well-being, which we'll talk about today, but also for the well-being of the spaces that we work in. Okay. So here's our agenda for today. We'll start off with a Trauma 101 review. So for those of you who attended the Child Trauma Introduction webinar I did a few weeks ago, this part will look a little bit familiar to you, but I chose to start with reviewing child trauma because there's really an undeniable parallel here, and it's helpful to remind ourselves about how trauma impacts individuals. And I hope we see by the end of this presentation that it doesn't look too different when we're talking about the impact of trauma on ourselves as well. Jumped ahead there. Okay, so then after that, we'll kind of shift for the rest of our time together to talk about the impact of indirect trauma, the different types of indirect trauma, and then how we recognize that in ourselves and what it looks like and what we can do. Okay, so this quote might look familiar, but we're going to be spending a bunch of time together today talking about child trauma as well as the emotional impact of the work we do, which I'm sure none of you is a surprise that can be a heavy topic. So I like to start off by remembering this quote, that although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of the overcoming of it. So this can kind of be our North Star as we move forward today. Okay, so let's dive in. So what is child traumatic stress? So it's witnessing or experiencing an event that poses a real or perceived threat. And this event overwhelms one's ability to cope. So in essence, trauma really changes the way that individuals see themselves, see others, including us as helping professionals, and they see the world around them. And this word perceived is particularly important in the definition because really it's all about how that child, how that individual perceives the experience. And because of that, trauma is going to be unique for every individual. So you can have twins that grew up in the same home that experience the same trauma that might have a different reaction to that, right? No two individuals will have the exact same trauma response. And so this is really important to hold in our minds, not only as we think about and talk a little bit about how kids respond to the experience of trauma, but also as we start to shift into thinking about how we as helping professionals are impacted by trauma, the same is going to hold true, right? That we will all have slightly different responses to being exposed to traumatic stress. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about different types of trauma. So there's kind of two buckets here. We've got natural traumas that we talk about, like illness, global pandemics, accidents, loss, death, natural disasters. And then we have non-natural disasters, human-made traumas. So I was hoping in the chat box, if you all can just type in what are the different types of traumas that you see with the kids and families that you serve or that you work with. So fires, absolutely, especially here in California, that's definitely something that we see. Domestic violence, racial trauma, depression, domestic violence, neglect, family violence, medical neglect, educational neglect, abandonment, loss, death, poverty, impacted by the system, right? Homelessness, sexual abuse, traumatic interactions with law enforcement, gangs, racial inequity. Absolutely. Food insecurity, traumatic grief. Definitely. Yeah, those are all spot on examples of the different types of child trauma that we see in the varying fields that we work in. Family violence, I know folks that said domestic violence before. Absolutely. Great, thank you guys. Okay, so we know there's lots of different types of trauma that we might see, that we might come across in the work that we do. There are also different categories of trauma. So there's what we call an acute trauma, which is a single traumatic event that's time limited. So we can think about a car crash, something that happens kind of one time. Then we have chronic trauma, which refers to the experience of multiple traumatic events. So it could be the same type of trauma, like physical abuse repeating, or multiple different types of trauma. Then we have complex trauma, which is essentially chronic trauma with an added criteria that the trauma is perpetuated by a caregiver or an individual close to that child. So there's a relational component with that complex trauma where that social contract is really broken, that the people who are supposed to love us the most don't hurt us, right? And when we're thinking about complex trauma, that trauma typically begins when that child is young. And so we separate trauma into these different categories because what we know from the literature is that children with chronic and complex trauma tend to have more of a significant trauma response, right? And I don't think that's too much of a stretch to kind of understand. It has profound effects on nearly every aspect of that child development and functioning. And then, as some of you guys mentioned in the chat already, things like historical trauma. So historical trauma is that intergenerational trauma experienced by a specific cultural group that has a history of being systematically oppressed. And it's a collective, cumulative emotional wounding that not only affects that individual, but continues to affect subsequent generations. And so as we work with families, it's really important to keep this in mind. Right, that individual context that those families bring. Individuals with historical trauma might mistrust or have awareness of services that are meant to support them, right? And being mindful of this, we can better connect with those families and understand the narratives that they bring not only to their child's trauma, but to their interactions with the helping professionals as well. Okay. So who goes on to develop child trauma? Approximately 1/3 of kiddos who experience a traumatic event will go on to develop PTSD. That means the majority of kids do not. And it can sometimes feel like working in whatever field you work in that is close to child maltreatment, that it feels like every kid who experiences trauma goes on to develop PTSD. But the reality is that they don't, right? Most kids are resilient. And so there are different sources of resilience. For folks that have done this work for a while, that first picture might look familiar. We really used to think about resilience as these kind of dandelion children, that they just had something magical and special in them. And we think about it sometimes as temperament, just as part of our personality that we've got. But within the last decade, we've learned that resilience is more what Anne Maston, which is the book I shared on the screen here, termed ordinary magic. Meaning that children just have a natural resilience that is really common. And one of the strongest studies that we know from the literature is that the greatest source of resilience is a nurturing and sensitive caregiver or an adult figure, like a grandparent, another family member, or a helping professional like us. So that's great news. There are also risk factors for developing post-traumatic stress or traumatic stress response. So things like temperament, developmental delays, limited social emotional skills, previous trauma exposure, pre-existing psychopathology, low social support. But I really, if you look at all of these, I believe that, yes, these are risk factors, but they're risk factors because they really impede the ability for that child or that youth to access that social support that is really such a key factor in resilience. So this is really helpful to keep in mind as we're thinking about child trauma. Okay, so before I click through my screen next, in the chat box, if you guys could just share what do you see in the kids and families that we work with? What are some of the effects of trauma? What are either the feelings, the thoughts, the behaviors? What are the things that you see in the kids and families that you work with that have been exposed to trauma? What are those kind of trauma symptoms? So all caps, aggression. I love that. Absolutely. Disengaged, anxiety, withdrawal, difficulty in school, pervasive shame. I think that's so important to keep in mind, and how heavy that feeling can be when we walk around with that feeling pervasively. Illness, anger, anxiety, low self-esteem, low motivation, right? Maybe a loss of purpose, distrust for others, an inability to regulate emotions. I can tell you guys are all pretty expert. Fear, withdrawal, absolutely. Isolation, problems with sleep. That's a key, sleep disorders. That's a key symptom of post-traumatic stress. Absolutely. Great job, guys. So here we see we've kind of organized it into these categories: intrusive symptoms, negative thoughts, avoidance, or that withdrawal, that arousal, that hyperactivity. And I like to think about it as there's kind of, you can either there's an overreaction, right, or that underreaction. So that overreaction of that hyperarousal, that aggression, that irritability. Then there's also that under arousal of withdrawing, right, and isolating. And individuals, like we talked about from that first slide, there's a whole range. It could look very different for different kids and families that we work with. And they can have a lot of different overreactions and underreactions. So it's really helpful to keep in mind all these different ways that kids and families can respond. Okay, so before we shift into talking about the impact of trauma on us as helping professionals, just want to do this activity here. So in the chat, when you see this picture, just type in what feelings come to mind when you see this image. If you're walking down the street, you see this dog, what comes to mind? Fear, 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 fear. Okay, absolutely, definitely fear. Aggressive, your heart starting to beat faster, absolutely. What might we do when we have run? Thank you, Mary. Yeah, we're running away, right? We're scared, we're getting out of there. Absolutely, rightly so. Okay, then we see this picture. Fight or flight, that's a good one. So what thoughts come to mind when we see this image now? Has anything changed? What kind of thoughts come? How can I help? Pain, sadness. I want to help with that poor pup, right? Empathy, empathy. Absolutely. Oh no, this individual needs help. This animal needs help, right? Absolutely. And so this is really what being trauma informed is all about. Right? Because for our kiddos and families, that trap that we saw, that's invisible. That hurt is inside, and oftentimes we can't see it. But we can see those bared teeth in that first picture. That's what presents in our offices. That's what we read about. That's what the image comes to mind when we read about the kids running away and being manipulative and being aggressive, right? That's what parents report when they're really struggling with the kiddos. And if we're not coming from a trauma-informed place, if we don't have our trauma-informed hats on, that's what we're going to be responding to, is those bared teeth. And so being in trauma-informed is really when we shift our perspective to really see that whole picture, right? So instead of just seeing those behaviors, which we're going to respond to, we're now really understanding the pain that's inside, and we can respond to that. So that was a real quick run through of child trauma. I know just a review, so I'd like to take just a minute right now to just reflect for a moment. It was a real quick run through, but just kind of one takeaway point you heard. You can either write it down, maybe it was all review, maybe something stood out more during this presentation, but just one thing that you took about child trauma. And you can write it in the chat if you'd like, or you could just write it down as well. And then we'll kind of reflect on that and then shift a little to thinking about indirect trauma. So perception is key. Couldn't agree more there, right? We need to see beyond the behavior, respond to pain, not the behavior, absolutely. And I think that's a journey because that's really hard to do. We're not really, well trained for that often, right? It's a constant fight or flight response. Resiliency is not an innate trait. And I love that. And it can be for some, but for the most part, it's really that access to social support and social skills. Asking ourselves what instead of why, right? So folks in this field, we really know that that's our motto, right? Asking what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you. Okay. Thank you, guys. Okay. So now we're going to shift a bit into starting to talk about ourselves and the impact that this work has on us as helping professionals. So I know there are folks on this webinar from different fields, but in our professions, we might be directly exposed to trauma, maybe if we're going into homes or certain neighborhoods or just some of the interactions we have on the job. But more commonly, there's another way that we can be impacted by the work that we do, and that's indirectly. So what I mean by that is hearing children's stories of the difficult or scary things that happen to them. Maybe reading narratives or reports about children and families being harmed or mistreated. It's really that day in, day out closeness to trauma. And this is what we want to focus on today in our time together. What is the impact or toll of working in this field? And how do we acknowledge this and create a safe and supportive way to continue to do this work? Okay, so starting with an activity. When you see this picture, just simply type in the chat first couple thoughts that come to your mind. Peaceful, 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 serene, beautiful, calm, relaxing, absolutely relaxing, calm, quiet, vacation, isolation, restful, I want to be there, so do I, spacious, great. You think, you just like feel like you take a deep breath, right? Peaceful, restful, healing, absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to share a story from an author of this book that I absolutely love. And I promise you I will share the book later in the slides. But this author was on vacation. She was walking with her family. It was a clear, warm evening. The breeze is light and warm, the water's sparkling. They turn around on their walk and they come upon these cliffs. And her first thought is just like you all, how beautiful. And her second thought was, I wonder how many people have killed themselves by jumping off those cliffs. Where would the helicopter land? Where's the nearest level 1 trauma center? How long will it take for them to get here? Right? And so I like this example because unfortunately it does resonate with me a little bit, but it also highlights how insidious the impact of our work can be. We don't just wake up one day with our hair falling out and having nightmares every night. Right, the impact of our work kind of creeps up on us, kind of softly and lightly, and it builds up over time. And so you might have heard the sentiment that in our work, we're like a vessel for kids and families. They just pour into us, and we're there as this emotional container, and all of the trauma and all of the maltreatment that we're around and near and read about every day just kind of flows through us, right? At the end, we get up out of our chair, we go home, we leave the office, that's it. But I like to think of us more as strainers, right? Things get stuck, and they can be big things like when a child dies or when the outcome is the opposite of what we want, but they can also be small things that build up over time. like families no-show over and over again, or a family's chronically late, or a child or a caregiver is rude or disrespectful, or sometimes we don't get closure to, the work that we're doing. We don't know the outcomes. And these things build up, right? And we can't really process them in the moment because we have another meeting, we have to write that report, someone's calling us. And so they just sit there, but we know that they're going to come out in some way. And Tony, I so appreciate you saying that in the chat, that I thought that, but maybe I was morbid for thinking that. And I think that's the point of why we're all here today, is to normalize that this impacts, the work we do impacts us. And if we don't talk about it, and if we don't start addressing it with one another, then it continues to build. So I really appreciate that comment. And so what happens? Before I start, I just want to know if anyone knows what this picture is, or if I'm very out of date and out of touch. But if anyone can write in the chat, Jones, right? What's the first word? If anyone, osmosis Jones. Okay, great. Try finding a picture of osmosis that is easy to share with audience. But yes, osmosis occurs, right? So we absorb and accumulate the stress and the trauma to the point that it can just become part of us, just like that author with the cliffs, right? And so I'd love to hear from you guys. I know I'm asking you to chat a lot in the chat box, but what do you think happens if we ignore the stuff that sticks in the strainer? What do you think happens if we ignore the impact of this work on ourselves? It builds up depression, it accumulates, burnout, build up, absolutely. We might break down. What you resist persists. Our body will let us know, right? That we've reached our limits. Our bodies do not lie. Can't be fully there for our clients. We might feel fatigued. Absolutely. We'll talk about all of these a little bit more later, but these are all spot on, right? Loss of productivity, right? We can't filter through as much. Maybe our performance suffers a bit. Absolutely. Compassion fatigue. Absolutely. So here, I really like this quote, because I think this is an old but true, tried and true message that I think has been, sorry, not true, but an old message that I think we've heard for a really long time in our organizations and in our fields. And to some extent, we might have internalized, and there might be folks that you work with, it might be us too, that still internalizes this message a bit, that if you're tough enough and cool enough and committed to your cause enough, you'll keep on keeping on. You'll just suck it up. That self-care is for the weaker set. I don't do that, right? But this is an antiquated mindset, and one that we now know has been proven not just to be not helpful, but it's harmful over time. And so what I hope, and where I hope we're moving to, is this new message, that the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet, right? So what we're suggesting here is that this work evokes difficult feelings, and it's really just unrealistic for us to expect that it won't have an impact on us, that at some point or many points in our careers, we'll have difficult or potentially painful feelings or unhelpful thoughts, or maybe our actions and behaviors aren't going to be the best, right? And that this is a normal human part of the job. I also believe, though, that now that we know this, we don't have to just succumb and expect and sit with this suffering either. We can arm ourselves with tools and arm our organizations with tools, so that that we have strategies for addressing the stress that we experience in the work that we do. So just to kind of drive that point home, I think a reason that we're starting to move to this newer message is because the impact of indirect trauma has just become undeniable. So we see here that the impact of trauma on the workforce is really widespread. So this slide, if you'll see on the very bottom, I adapted it from Trauma Informed Oregon, which is a wonderful organization. I included their website on the bottom there. If you'd like to learn more, they have great resources around trauma and being trauma informed and secondary traumatic stress. So we see here in social workers, in one study, 65% had at least one symptom of secondary traumatic stress. 42% of social workers experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. These are high statistics. In law enforcement, we see 37% of correctional officers experience burnout. Among child welfare workers, 50% had traumatic stress symptoms in the severe range in one study, and these are recent studies. Estimated employee turnover in child welfare is between 30 to 40% nationally. And I know at least in California, in some counties, it's above 50%. That's really, really high, right? Preschool teachers turnover is 25 to 50% per year. So we know that not addressing the impact of our work is just not sustainable. I also want to share this slide from the sanctuary model, so it might look familiar to some folks on here. It's adapted by Sandra Bloom, but she talks about the parallel process. When 2 or more systems, whether they consist of individuals, groups, organizations, when there's a significant relationship with one another, they tend to develop similar affect, cognitions, and behaviors, which is defined as a parallel process. So essentially, our organizations and us as helping professionals can start to look like the clients we serve, right? If we're working with clients who feel unsafe, have anger and aggression, are helpless, hopeless, hyper aroused, we can see how that can start to either in ourselves or in our organizations, that we can start to mimic that. Okay. So since the 80s, so for like 3 decades, professionals have really been working to define what we're talking about. So the emotional impact of doing the work that we do. And there are a lot of terms out there, and honestly, I think it can be a bit confusing. So I like to use this diagram, which might look familiar to some folks. It's from the Professional Quality of Life, or ProQual measure, and that is the most commonly used tool or measure to assess the impact of this work on helping professionals, and it includes these different subscales of compassion satisfaction, compassion fatigue, burnout, and secondary traumatic stress. And so we'll spend some time talking a little bit about what these are and the definitions and what they look like and why we're parsing them out this way as well. Okay. So I want to do a little activity just to kind of learn about these terms and the definitions. So I'm gonna, you'll see on the bottom in that gray box on your screen, we're gonna be either choosing between vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to talk about vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress as the same term. I'm just going to call it secondary traumatic stress because it's often used interchangeably in the literature. Then compassion satisfaction, compassion fatigue, and burnout. So the first definition, you guys will see a poll that will pop up where you can choose what you think this definition matches to. So the cost of caring for others in pain, characterized by reduced empathy and energy for their patients, loved ones, and coworkers. Do we think that's vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, compassion satisfaction, burnout? I'm seeing lots of answers come in. This is very fun. Thank you guys for participating. Everything's going all over the place. Okay, so we still got some votes coming in, so I'll give it a couple more seconds. Okay, we've got one inching higher and higher. Okay, we're gonna try and get to 80%. So far we've got 57%, so I think we can do this. You guys are a very engaged group. Okay, we're past 60. Thank you guys. Okay, we're gonna close it in about 5 seconds. Let's get your last votes in. We can't see it's anonymous, by the way. Okay, we're gonna stop it there. And I'm gonna share the results. So we got 72% of folks thought compassion fatigue, and then a smattering of vicarious trauma, compassion satisfaction, burnout. So those that guess compassion fatigue are correct. So we define compassion fatigue as the cost of caring, really, for others in pain, characterized by really this reduced empathy and energy, exhaustion for our coworkers, but also as we continue to talk and learn about compassion fatigue, it's also something that can spread into our personal life as well. We'll talk a little bit more about compassion fatigue and the symptoms in a bit. Okay, let's do the next one. So process of elimination is happening here, so it'll get easier. Okay, so we can launch this poll: the emotional duress that helping professionals involved in the care of traumatized children experience. Okay, votes are flowing in now. Thank you, guys. We got the hang of the polls. We're just going to give it a minute and then we'll share those results. Okay. All right, I'm going to end it here. Good job, guys. Oops. I'm going to share that. Maybe I just stopped sharing. There we go. Now I started sharing. Okay. So if you can't see the screen, if you can, 73% said vicarious trauma / secondary traumatic stress, and you guys are correct. So when we're thinking about secondary traumatic stress, and again, we'll go into this detail a little bit more, we're really thinking of almost kind of like similar symptoms to PTSD. So that traumatic response that we can get as helping professionals from the experience of indirect trauma. Okay, we've got one more. Let's see. So chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. Just give a couple of seconds here. Okay, good job, guys. Yeah, this one's pretty obvious, so I'm going to end us here. We've got 96% at burnout. Absolutely. So when we're thinking of burnout, we're thinking of it as more of a workplace stressor. And then lastly, we've got compassion satisfaction, which we don't need a poll for. It's the last one, but it's the pleasure you derive from being able to do your work. So I'm a visual person, and that might have been helpful for you. Just an additional way to kind of understand those different definitions. Right, these are all reactions to stress. If we just take away compassion satisfaction, but vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, burnout, these are all stress reactions, right? And so I think it can still be a little confusing. So I like to think of it in these two buckets. We can have that organizational stress, which is what we think of as burnout. So this kind of stress is that workplace stress. So my commute to work, the paperwork, the time crunches, my salary isn't what I want it to be. My workplace culture isn't great. I don't really like my supervisor. These are the stressors that come from working in the climate that you work in. Yes, paperwork is real. So that's a real stressor. So these, we can get that when we hear burnout, we're thinking about it as kind of an organizational stress. Then we also have this interpersonal stress, which is really the emotional impact of working with children and families exposed to trauma. So I think of compassion fatigue as more of that broader term. It's this broader impact that we have of working in and around trauma. So that cognitive, physical, emotional, behavioral impact of working in this field. And then from compassion fatigue, we can develop secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma, which we think of as a kind of more severe, looking a little bit more like PTSD. So I hope that's helpful in kind of thinking about the different types of stressors. And we separate them because the way we respond to them is going to be different. So it's really helpful to reflect on what kind of stress am I feeling, right? If the majority of my stress is around my workplace climate and culture, around the amount of paperwork, those things, the drive to work, the difficult relationships with my colleagues, toxic meetings, those kinds of things, if that's the majority of your stress, then the way you respond to that is going to be different than if your stress response is you know, loss of empathy for clients, hopelessness, nightmares, right? And so we want to separate those. However, we also know that they're interrelated. So you can imagine that if you have a high level of burnout because you work in maybe an environment that isn't as psychologically safe or healthy, the reality is that you're more vulnerable then to incur compassion fatigue or secondary traumatic stress. So we think of them as kind of separate stressors, but they also are interrelated. Okay, just checking the questions to see if anyone had any questions about that, or if, hopefully that's clear. We'll talk a little bit more about what those symptoms look like and what they can look like for us now. Okay, so let's start with compassion fatigue. All of us, just like we talked about in the beginning, how trauma impacts everyone uniquely, so it'll be the same thing for us. So everyone will have their own signs or warning signs that we're experiencing compassion fatigue. So things like exhaustion, just feeling exhausted when you're starting your day, maybe dragging your feet, taking time off and coming back to work and still feeling really physically drained, feeling anger, irritability, and again, that can look different for everyone. Increased use of alcohol or substances. And again, the key here is the word increased. All of these things I think we just experience as humans, but we're thinking of, okay, is the frequency of this really escalating? Dread of working with certain clients. So you look on your roster, you look at your activity list, and you're like, oh God, not that, right? Sometimes we start to dread the things that are maybe subconsciously even causing us stress. Diminished sense of enjoyment in our career, heightened anxiety or irrational fears, difficulty separating work from personal life. So that can look like working through lunch every day, not taking any vacations, carrying your phone everywhere, or always being kind of a slave to your email. Absenteeism, starting to miss work, taking many sick days. Impaired ability to make decisions or care for patients, or problem with personal relationships. And like I said before, we try and think that we have a work life and a home life and they're just completely separate. But unfortunately, in the work that we do, the impact of our work is not just going to stay within our confinements of our office, especially now that most of us or many of us are working from home. This can really impact our relationships with individuals as well, with our loved ones, with our friends and family. And if we think about that slide on resilience, where we talked about for child trauma, the greatest source of resilience is that social connection. This can really be problematic. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight here again, it is the increase in these things. There's lots of reasons we can feel exhausted, but are we starting to recognize that this is really happening more and more for ourselves? Okay, so just like with child trauma, there are lots of different factors that can contribute to us developing compassion fatigue. Like most things in life, compassion fatigue exists on a continuum, meaning that at various times in our careers, we may feel very beaten down by this, and other times we might feel more immune, and that's normal. And so these are some different factors that contribute to that continuum. So it could be some of our personal vulnerabilities, like we might have our own trauma history, right? Or our current life circumstances. Maybe we have a lot of stress going on at home or in our personal relationships. Our coping style, have we built up a healthy way to manage stress? Can we rely on that coping skill when we're getting stressed? The working conditions, maybe it's particularly understaffed right now, or there's changes in leadership, or it's a particularly toxic work environment. And so just keeping in mind that these things will ebb and flow over the course of our careers, as will our vulnerability and susceptibility to compassion fatigue. Okay, so I want us to do a little activity now again here where I'm going to go back to those symptoms of compassion fatigue, and I'm going to ask you guys a question. So let's see if I can get back there. Here we go. So if you can launch that poll. Okay, so this is an anonymous question, so we will not know your response, but people I see already feel comfortable responding. So just a yes or no, have you experienced 3 or more compassion fatigue symptoms in the past 4 months? I really appreciate folks engaging and participating in this one. We'll give it some time for folks to kind of reflect and look at those symptoms and think about how it's been for them. Okay, we've I'm going to close it in just a couple of seconds since we've got over 70% of folks voting in. Okay, I'm going to stop it here. So I'm going to share this with you all. So about 75% of folks on this webinar have experienced 3 or more compassion fatigue symptoms in the past 4 months. And I think that's pretty significant to recognize. You know, I do this activity a lot with different organizations, and it's often the same that a large majority of folks are experiencing this traumatic stress response. And what we often don't do is normalize that and validate that your feelings that you're experiencing are real and that this is something that we experience. And, you know, we say the same thing for our kiddos, right? We know that normalizing and letting them know that they're not alone in this is so helpful and that the feelings that they're having are real. We deserve that same thing, right? And so even an activity like this, just being together and knowing that we're not alone in our feelings and our responses to the difficult work we do can be really helpful. I love, can we include a burnout, one on burnout? I'm sure that one is incredibly high too. Joel, I don't have that poll ready, but when I've done that poll with folks, we see that as well, that burnout is really high as well among participants. And I think that's important to keep in mind, again, that we can have both, but really figuring out what's the stress for you. So I appreciate that comment. Okay. So that was compassion fatigue and the symptoms of compassion fatigue. We'll do another little activity later on about what that can, like diving down a little bit deeper on what that could look like. We also have secondary traumatic stress. And it was really a concept that was developed by trauma specialists in the early 90s. They were trying to really understand why helping professionals seemed to be having symptoms that looked really similar to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but they weren't necessarily having exposure to trauma, right? It was the indirect trauma. And now we know that this is what this phenomenon is. It's this emotional duress that we have as helping professionals, that we can have as helping professionals. And it's a response that looks similar to PTSD. I'll also share that I've done this poll with many different organizations, child serving systems, and the numbers are pretty high as well. Usually around 80% of participants are reporting significant symptoms of secondary traumatic stress within the past 4 months. Now, I'll also note that the past 4 months for everyone this past year has been increasingly stressful, but I have been doing this for a while, and those results hold true. Okay. I do see a question here that I'll just address since we're talking about this topic. Andrew, do you notice any differences in the prevalence of compassion fatigue in the different genders or race and ethnicities? I think that is such an important question, and I actually wish I had some data to point you to that has looked at that. I actually don't know if the literature has gotten to that point. I think it might have, and I'm happy to follow up. We have spent a lot of time just operationalizing what these terms mean so we can start to study them and start to look at them. But my guess is that we would see disparities there. People that, just like I said with the burnout, if we're more vulnerable to stress already by being disenfranchised in some way, then I imagine that we'll be more vulnerable to different stressors in our work environment. But I think that's a really interesting question. Okay. So symptoms of secondary traumatic stress, I think we pretty much covered this, but again, it can look a lot like PTSD. So that core symptom of avoidance, avoiding your clients, preoccupied with stories, maybe going home and really thinking about all the cases or the reports that you read. There are intrusive thoughts, nightmares, those hyper-aroused symptoms, feeling really isolated, maybe trapped, hopeless, that's a big one, feeling like, what am I even doing this work for? Having difficulty separating our work from our personal life, and maybe treating others in our life with less patience or just differently. I also want to normalize the impact of secondary trauma. So this is just from one study. We saw in a sample of child welfare system workers that 15.2 met full criteria for PTSD due to indirect trauma exposure. And I just saw a study that looked at COVID-19 as a potential trauma response, not necessarily the direct response of having COVID-19, but the impact of just everything else that comes along with it. We can talk about that for probably hours. I just want to throw that out there. We also saw in the sample that 45%, which is such a high percentage, endorsed intrusive thoughts. So again, just normalizing this experience. So, we started today by talking about how trauma impacts how kids see themselves and the world around them. And the impact of this work can also shift how we start seeing ourselves and the world around us. So I just love this image here because I think it really just highlights that secondary trauma compassion fatigue, the challenging work that we do can really impact how we see the world around us. But it's not all doom and gloom, or I would not be presenting on this topic, right? That would be very depressing. We have options. We can make a difference without suffering. Yes, there will be sadness and pain and worry. We can't avoid that, right? I think somebody in the questions we asked participants to submit any questions beforehand that they had, and someone said, "How can we avoid traumatic stress?" The answer is we really can't, but there are ways that we can respond to it. There are ways that we can prepare ourselves for this, right? We can enjoy the world and set it straight. So one of the first steps is to start to get inquisitive with ourselves. How have I changed? Have I changed? What are, if any, my warning signs or symptoms of compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress? Okay. So what I'd love us to do now, like I said, one of the first things we can do is recognize our own symptoms. This is where I wish we were all together and we could do this together. But since we're on Zoom, what I'd love for you guys to do is just look at this list here. Again, we've gone through this. These are some signs and symptoms of compassion fatigue. If you can just write down, hopefully you have a pen and paper near you, or if you're on a computer, you can just type those out. And I'll give us just a minute just to write down the ones that relate to you. We know that they do, as we just did that poll together. So either the ones that relate to you, or maybe the ones that have related to you at some point in your career. And you can add them in the chat, or you can just write them down, because we'll be going to look back at them in a little bit. So I just encourage you to jot some down if you've got that ability. At some point, all of them. Absolutely. Yeah. This is where I wish we had some music I could play as you guys are writing down some of the symptoms. Luckily, I've worked with a lot of teenagers, so I'm very comfortable with silence, but we'll move on in a second or two. Thank you guys for starting to add some of those in the chat. I appreciate that. All right. So hopefully you guys have jotted down a couple of symptoms that you recognize for yourself. Okay. So once we're aware of our symptoms, we can start to develop a warning system. What do those symptoms look like for us? So this might look familiar if for those on the webinar that work with kiddos, but what does it look like when I'm doing good? What does it look like when I'm in the green zone? This yellow zone is really where we live most of the time, unfortunately. We have warning signs that emerge, but we just kind of ignore them. And then we have the red zone, which is kind of the danger zone. And you can see these arrows. We can move through these zones, and we can also move up and down within them. So I'm going to just go through an example of what I mean here. There we go. So for this example, hypothetical example, so when this person's doing good, they're enjoying their drive to work, right? They're not, we call that, God, I'm going to blank on the name now, but the kind of a conscious narrative that we have going in our heads, right? Are you driving to work thinking, oh my God, I have to do this again? Or your drive to work is kind of pleasant, right? So this is what it looks like when we're doing good, or when this person's doing good, looking forward to seeing their clients, feeling energized, sharing positive work stories with friends. Hey, this great thing happened today. That general sense of feeling proud, right? Maybe going to the gym, eating well. So you can see it can reach a couple of different kind of areas of our life. When we're in the yellow zone, maybe it looks like being sensitive to things like TV or movies. All of a sudden, you're crying at a commercial, and that's not normal for you. Your body is tense. You know, thinking of that heightened sense of anxiety as a symptom, what does that look like? It can look like tenseness in our bodies, specifically maybe picking at nails. We saw that symptom of alcohol and substances. Maybe it looks like drinking more frequently. That symptom of irritability. So maybe it can look like, for some people, that must be nice attitude, like, oh, you get to go on vacation, must be nice. I don't really have time for that, right? That's not a very healthy attitude for us to keep adopting. Diminished enjoyment in our work, that was one of those symptoms. And so maybe that could look like feeling really relieved when my clients cancel. And then problem with personal relationships was another one of those symptoms. And so maybe that can look like less interesting in socializing. You're not really accepting invitations, of course, now. Maybe those are Zoom invitations, but still. And then the red zone can look a little bit more severe. So here we've got emotional exhaustion. Maybe I'm distancing from people. I'm starting to dread work. I'm feeling helpless. I'm having nightmares. And so one of the things we can do for ourselves when we're starting to really want to work on how can we address and how can we respond to compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress within ourselves is first thinking about what those symptoms are and then what they really look like for us. So really diving down and operationalizing what those symptoms look like. That way we can recognize, okay, I'm in the yellow zone. What can I do when I'm in the yellow zone? And so then after we recognize our symptoms, after we figure out what that actually looks like for us, then we want to start adding strategies. So when I'm in the yellow zone, maybe I'm asking for a little bit of time off, or maybe I'm starting to ask for additional supervision, etc. We'll go into some of those suggestions in a little bit. What we want to do is come up with strategies for the yellow zone, and lots of them, so that we don't get to the red zone, because we know that it's really harder to operate from that place. Okay. I will notice in the chat that one person shared that when I feel the diminished enjoyment in the work, it makes me feel guilty. And I really appreciate that comment, because that's often what happens when we start to feel these kind of warning signs, is that we add another one on top of it, which is guilt and shame, right? And that's, you know, logically we know that that's not helpful, but that's definitely a normative response that can happen. And so what I'd like to do for all of us is really normalize that is okay and that's going to happen, that this is a part of our job, that it doesn't mean we're bad at our jobs, it doesn't mean we can't hang, it doesn't mean, sometimes it can mean that this profession is not for us. It really can. If you're in the red zone all the time, then that's something to look at, and there's no shame in that either. But that if we're experiencing some of these yellow zone symptoms, that it might be time for us to activate some strategies. But I definitely understand that, the feelings that can come along with that. So this isn't super new. Again, for folks on here that work with kiddos, this is what we do with them, right? We do this. We help them identify clues so that they can realize when, you know, what their emotion is and what it actually looks like, and how to come up with strategies for that yellow zone, because we know that once we're in that red zone, it's like just back away. It's really hard to intervene at that point. And so again, we really want to start to do the same things for ourselves. We want to identify our own symptoms and figure out strategies for that. So we're going to spend some time, the rest of our time actually today, talking a little bit about strategies, but there will be, and I'll plug this again, but I'm doing another webinar, I know that Jess mentioned that in the beginning, that will look at some individual and organizational strategies to address compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress. Okay, so more than a nap and a spa, question mark. So we're talking about strategies to address compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress. And when you see this term, more than a nap and a spa, when you hear this, what comes to mind? What do you think when you hear this term? minimization, right? Maybe we need something more lasting, quick fixes. That there isn't a quick fix. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. That self-care isn't just the fun things. Oh, I love that so much. I'm going to steal that one. That maybe these are just band-aids that we need more. Absolutely. You guys are hitting the nail on the head here. So I do want to say that naps and spas are great and I recommend them and we should do them. But when we're talking about compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress, I fear that sometimes when we talk about self-care and we talk about it just in this way, we really minimize the serious impact this has on us as professionals. And so again, I highly encourage these self-care strategies, but what we call these kind of simple self-care. What we need to do is create a toolbox where we have additional strategies, more than one type of strategies, strategies that really highlight the specific symptoms that we're experiencing so that we can address secondary trauma. Yeah, I am way past a nap and a spa. Absolutely, I definitely understand that sentiment. That said, again, very helpful things, but we want to go, we want to be able to add to this toolbox. And so I wanted to share some of the ideas that you all came up with. So again, before this webinar, we asked you guys to share some strategies that you guys use as a way to address traumatic stress. And I summarized them and I just loved the ones that you guys came up with. So I wanted to highlight them. So I put them in kind of two buckets. I kind of think of them as kind of organizational strategies or workplace ones, and then kind of individual ones. So things talking about the situation. And I think that is so important. Finding ways that we can communicate with supervisors, debrief with our bosses, talking to our colleagues, right? Again, we think about resilience. We think about that social connection, how important that is. Doing webinars like this, engaging in information to learn and normalize the impact of compassion fatigue and secondary trauma. Requesting time off, delegating tasks when needed. There's a lot here and there's a lot more we can talk about with organizational strategies. One thing I will say though about debriefing with colleagues, and just one warning with this, is that what happens sometimes is we end up gunking all over everyone. And what that means is, we've just read or experienced something really emotionally triggering and we just let it out. We just share all the gory trauma details. And this isn't always helpful for us and it isn't always helpful and can be harmful for that person. However, we can share and talk about these experiences that we have in our work in a way that evokes empathy still and support from our colleagues and our friends without sharing those details, right? So let's say you just did an interview with a family and they've been, I can say, I've just did an interview with a family. They've been through so many horrific things. I'm feeling really shaken up right now. I really can't stop thinking about it. Right? And that's a way to share without really getting into the nuts and bolts of what the trauma was. And it's very normal for us to want to do this. We talk about fight, flight, freeze, but that fourth response is what people talk about as affiliate, right? If there's a bear in the woods and you get back to your cabin safely and you survive and you close the door, the first thing you want to do is tell somebody, right? We want to talk about the things that happen to us. That is just a normal human reaction. And so thinking about how can we do that in a trauma-informed way? Again, sharing the feelings that you're experiencing without necessarily sharing the trauma details. Okay, and then some individual strategies can be walking during break time, so taking breaks at work, being able to walk. We call that a hot walk and talk. So being able to walk and as you're maybe sharing some of the feelings that you're having, that can be really helpful. Things like listening to music, exercising, virtual socials, practicing self-reflection. So this is a good one. And I think someone mentioned before that not all self-care is necessarily pleasurable. It can be a bit challenging for us to self-reflect and to sit in the moment and to sit in our feelings. But again, if we're thinking about child trauma, it's what we ask of our kiddos and our families, and it's what can be really helpful for us as well. And again, it can be a little bit uncomfortable, but that's really the way through. And so some examples that you guys gave of that self-reflection are things like prayer or meditation that can be really useful. So I'm going to share this handout. This is a handout that you guys will get. It's from Tend Academy. They're a wonderful group of folks. They've got a lot of great resources. This is one of their resources that I wanted to make sure you guys had. It goes further into talking about what are some strategies that we can use to prepare or build our toolbox to be able to deal with compassion fatigue and secondary trauma. Again, there are things in here that are SPAs and NAPs, but they do go beyond that, right? So assessing our trauma inputs, learning more about compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, learning to say no more, attending workshops, considering joining a supervision or peer support group, consider starting a peer support group in your organization, things like that. Okay, so I'm going to share this story that is also from the book that I love that I promise I will start to talk about and share with you soon. But what the author talks about here is that we come into this work with a burning passion and a tremendous commitment, right? That's why we find ourselves in these helping professions. And there is time for fire, but what sustains the heat for the long haul are the coals. And oftentimes we don't have those coals, right? And so we talked about some ways that we can respond to this, identifying symptoms in ourselves, developing those warning signs, and pairing those warning signs with strategies that really are unique and particular for us. So I'd just like to share a couple others before we end together today. You might have thought I forgot about this, but we mentioned earlier on compassion satisfaction. So this is the pleasure you derive from being able to do the work that you do. What we do typically is we focus on the struggles or the difficult parts of our work. And that, again, that's normal. If you think about, you ask a colleague, you ask someone that you work with, what don't you like about your job? The floodgates will open, I promise. People will be able to come up with things, right? What don't you like about your work? Really easy, and it comes to us like nothing. But you ask them, what are some of the things about your job that gives you joy and fulfillment? And it takes a second for us because we really don't have a lot of opportunities when people ask us those kind of questions, right? But we know that asking these kinds of questions, helping to focus on the positive and the joys of our work, it helps us feel more supported, it boosts our confidence, right? And it can help remind us of the passion for this work that we do. And we can do this and we can make space for this in a couple of different ways, whether it's for ourselves or within our organizations. Just asking those simple questions. Where do you find joy in your work, right? What are you proud of with what just happened? I often do that, make sure I do that when things have gone very wrong and maybe somebody feels like they just super messed up and everything they didn't get the outcome they wanted. It was a terrible case. And asking that question, yes, a lot of things have gone wrong, but what do you find, what's one thing that you're proud of, right? Or maybe asking, what's a success you had this month? I know for us in unit meetings or in team meetings, people go around and share one thing that they're proud of in the week, even if it's just I got somebody to show up on time or I showed up on time. I mean, they can be really small things, but having this be a practice for us can be really helpful. So think of it as like a compassion satisfaction practice. And again, compassion satisfaction it's the antithesis, it's the opposite of that compassion fatigue. Okay, just some other kind of day-to-day strategies we can use. I'm definitely giving us a taste for what the next webinar on organizational strategies to address compassion fatigue and secondary trauma will look like. How do we begin and end a meeting? Do we just dive into the terrible things that are happening, or maybe dive into the really important critical incident or critical moment that we have to talk about? Or do we start with taking a breath and just orienting everyone and saying, I know we've been through a lot, and just normalizing what's going on? There's lots of things that happen in our organizations and we often don't talk about it. So how can we be transparent and consistent in our communication? Recognizing those goosebumps, right? So recognizing those things that give us that grace and goosebumps. How do we give individual recognition to people? So I know in the organization I work in, they've got these little trophies. They're kind of silly, but you give them out and it makes people feel good. And you're identifying, I'm giving this trophy to this individual because I really feel like they've done a really good job in X, Y, Z. And importantly, if you have the power to do so, or just as an individual, reinforcing when folks are doing this. So having this be reinforced when you see folks using self-care, when you see folks taking that mindful moment, when you see folks recognizing you're using compassion satisfaction, how do we reinforce that? Because we know that's what's going to keep those things going and alive. Okay, so just one last, second to last tool I'll share is this provider resilience app. It's something you can just download on your phone. It's really cool. I just downloaded it and I just tried it out and I really liked it. It's got tools that are just quick and easy exercises that you can do at your desk. It has some exercises for mindful moments and meditation practices. That measure that I mentioned before, the professional quality of life measure, which assesses burnout, compassion satisfaction, compassion fatigue, and secondary traumatic stress, it's on the app. And it gives you a score and it lets you know how you scored in comparison to other folks. So it gives you like a low, medium, low, moderate, or high. So that can be interesting. Gives you ideas for what to do on breaks. It's easy to download. That's what it looks like. And then finally, this is the book that I have been teasing the whole time. I really, really love this book. I hope it's not too grandiose to say that it definitely changed my life a little bit. It's called Trauma Stewardship, and it's an everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others. It's by Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky. I see some folks have done some of that in their offices. For me, we've done this in our office as a book club before. We've read a couple of chapters and got together and talked about what resonates with us, and it can be a really fun activity. But even if you just read it on your own, it really kind of puts in perspective the different things that we've been talking about, and also offers a lot of suggestions. With all of this, one thing I will say, and even though this is super cheesy, it really is about the journey, not the destination. So just because we've attended this webinar, we can't check off, okay, I've worked on compassion satisfaction, I've worked on secondary traumatic stress, right? This is kind of a journey we're all on, and one that's lifelong if we want to be in the professions that we're in for the long haul. And so it will require continual work, coming back to these resources, coming back to this information, spending time reflecting on where we're at in our work, in our emotions, in our personal relationships, and that cannot always be easy, especially if we're working in crisis-driven systems that are go, go, go. And so it will take, even though it seems so simple, it will take work just to take these mindful moments to really reflect on what compassion fatigue and what secondary trauma looks like for us, and what strategies we try out and test out and work and don't work, and kind of keep that process going. Richie, thank you for adding that trauma stewardship website. That's a good one. Okay, so I've kind of teased this here, but just moving into the next webinar that we do, we'll look at a little bit more of those organizational strategies and individual strategies. I know someone asked a question about supervision. So we will focus on things like reflective supervision, crisis debriefing, and different kinds of trainings. So just to kind of end together on this note, because we have talked a lot about suffering and pain and the emotional impact of not only child trauma on the kids and families that we serve, but on ourselves as helping professionals. The strongest people I've met have not been given an easier life. They've learned to create strength and happiness from dark places. So I truly do believe that doing this work not only makes us better able to serve the kids and families that we serve, but just also makes us better human beings. So thank you guys for participating, for listening today. I think we've got some time for questions if you have them, and then we've also got a couple slides to wrap us up.